The notice was pinned to the green baize board in the servants' hall. Its ink was stark and unforgiving, a list of new regulations written in the housekeeper's precise narrow hand, a tightening of the reins. It was a firm reassertion of an order that had in recent months felt adrift. Meg, her hands still damp from scrubbing the morning's flagstones, read it with her usual quiet stillness. Most of the rules were mundane, like no talking in the upper corridors after 10. There was a new schedule for polishing the silver. But the final point was different. It stood alone, separated by a hard, dark line. No member of the household staff was to approach, touch, or address the Duke's Wolfhound under any circumstances. Its care belonged solely to the head groom, and any infringement would mean immediate dismissal. Meg read the words twice, feeling the cold eyes of the other maids on her back. Their stares held a mixture of pity and sharp-edged satisfaction. They all knew who this rule was really for. It was not for Mary, who shrieked if the beast so much as rounded a corner. It was not for young Agnes, who crossed herself when his great grey head appeared at a window. It was for her, Meg, the quiet maid who seemed to attract the ghost-haunting Raventhorn. The Wolfhound's name was Cinder. He was a creature of mythic proportions, a giant of shaggy iron-gray fur, with eyes like winter twilight. He had belonged to the Duke's younger brother, Lord Edward. Since Edward's death in a reckless riding accident 6 months ago, the dog had become a living monument to grief. He ate almost nothing, obeyed no one, and stalked the halls like a specter. His presence was a constant, unnerving reminder of the laughter that no longer echoed in these cold stone corridors. Everyone feared him, viewing the beast as the four-legged embodiment of the sorrow settling over the great house. Everyone, it seemed, except Meg. He did not fear or despise her, and that was the real problem. She never sought him out, never called to him, and never offered him scraps from the kitchens. She simply did her work, a small, slight figure in a drab gray gown. Her movements were always economical, her face composed, yet Cinder always found her. Their first meeting happened in the long gallery. She was dusting the grim portraits of the Duke's ancestors, her cloth moving in silent, practiced circles. Feeling a sudden shift in the air, a heavy weight, she turned to find him standing there, his massive form filling the doorway. He was nearly as tall as a pony head, lowered his gaze, locked on her. The other maid. Sarah dropped her feather duster with a gasp and fled. Meg simply stood still. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. She did not move. She did not speak. She merely watched him, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm in her chest. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, padding across the polished floor. His claws made no sound as he came to a stop, just a few feet from her. He lay down, not with a crash, but with a slow, deliberate folding of his long limbs, until he was a mountain of gray fur at her feet. Resting his great head on his paws, he emitted a low, rumbling sound. It was not a growl. It was something else, something deeper and far more weary. He just watched her, his ancient eyes never leaving her face as she finished dusting and quietly left. Since then, it had become a pattern. In the library, as she carefully wiped dust from the leather-bound spines, he would appear and lie by the cold fireplace. In the gardens, as she weeded the rose beds, he would settle in the shade of a yew hedge nearby. He never demanded a thing. He simply stayed near a silent, immense, and gentle shadow. The other staff saw it as witchcraft, a terrible omen. The housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, saw it as an intolerable breach of discipline. "He is not a pet girl," she had hissed at Meg just last week, her face pinched with displeasure. "He is the Duke's sorrow, and you will not meddle with it." Meg had simply inclined her head, replying that she did not meddle, and that he came to her. "Then see that he does not." The housekeeper snapped her black eyes like chips of jet. Now came this notice, a public declaration, a line drawn in the sand. Meg was being warned, and the entire household stood witness. She lowered her gaze from the board, smoothed her apron, and turned to fetch the pails for washing the front steps. She would obey. She had to. Her position here was far too precarious, and her true purpose too vital to risk over a dog, no matter how lonely he seemed. Besides, her name was not Meg. Her name was Margaret Whitley. She had come to Raventhorn not for a maid's wages, but for justice. This grand, cold grieving house held the key to her past and the only hope for her future. Her father, a respected scholar, had died 2 years ago, leaving his only child a modest but secure inheritance, a small property in Devon, and a collection of rare annotated first editions. They were worth a fortune, but she had never seen a single penny. A distant cousin of her mother's, a man named Finch, had produced a revised will that left everything to him. He had swept in, sold the books, claimed the property, and cast her out with nothing but a few pounds and a warning to stay quiet. Her father's solicitor was conveniently replaced. The witnesses were Finch's cronies, and she was left adrift, her very identity erased. To make matters worse, Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper of Raventhorn, was that man's sister. Margaret had spent a year in destitution before a letter from her father's old friend, a retired academic, finally found her. He believed her. He remembered her father speaking of his prized collection and his clear intention to leave everything to his daughter. He also remembered something else, that her father had been consulting on the cataloguing of the library at Raventhorn for the old Duke Philip's father. He suspected some of her father's most valuable books, and perhaps even the original deed to the property, had been stored there for safekeeping away from prying eyes. It was a long shot, a desperate hope. So Margaret Whitley vanished, and Meg, a quiet girl with forged references, secured a job as a junior housemaid at Raventhorn. She had spent the last 3 months learning the layout of the estate, the rhythms of the staff, and the cold, distant habits of its master, the Duke of Whitchurch. She was waiting for her chance to search the library, the one place holding the answers. The library was the Duke's sanctuary. He spent most of his hours there, buried in estate papers, a formidable and unapproachable figure. Philip IX, Duke of Whitchurch, was a man carved from the same granite as his ancestral home, tall and severe, with raven-black hair and a face that seemed utterly incapable of a smile. He had inherited the title the Grief and the Ghost Hound all at once. He moved through his home in heavy silence, his presence as chilling as the Northumbrian damp. Meg knew him only as a pair of polished boots passing in a corridor, a curt nod, or a deep voice commanding a footman. He had never truly looked at her. To him, she was just another piece of the household machinery, silent and invisible. That was exactly how she needed it to be. But the new rule about the dog made her task much harder. Cinder's strange affinity for her had actually been a form of camouflage. While he was near, the other staff kept their distance, leaving her alone to observe and plan. Now she would be watched. Every interaction, every single moment would be scrutinized by Mrs. Finch. Shivering, she carried the heavy buckets of water to the grand entrance. The autumn air was sharp with the scent of wood smoke. She knelt on the cold stone, her brush biting into the grime. She worked methodically, her mind entirely focused on the library. She had to find a way in, a time when the Duke was absent and the room stood empty late at night, perhaps after the house had gone to sleep. Then a shadow fell over her. She did not even need to look up to know who it was. The sheer size of the silhouette, the faint musky scent of dog and moorland, it was Cinder. He had come around the side of the house and now stood on the top step looking down at her. He whined a soft, questioning sound deep in his chest. Meg's hands stilled in the water. She kept her head bowed, her eyes fixed on the gray stone. "Go away," she whispered the words, barely audible. "You must not be here," she pleaded. The dog whined again, a more insistent note this time. He took a step down, then another, until his huge head was level with hers. He nudged her shoulder with his wet nose, in a gentle, imploring gesture. She could feel the warmth of his breath, the solid, living presence of him. A profound loneliness radiated from the animal, a grief so vast it seemed to sink into her own bones. He was asking for something. Comfort, acknowledgement, a touch. Her hand ached to reach out and stroke the shaggy fur between his ears. It would be so easy, a small kindness, but the housekeeper's words echoed in her mind, sharp and cold. "Immediate dismissal. I cannot," she whispered, shaking her head. She picked up her brush and began to scrub with a renewed, almost desperate energy. "Please go," she begged, For a long moment the dog remained a silent, hopeful statue. Then, with a sigh that seemed to blow the dead leaves across the terrace, he padded slowly back up the steps and disappeared around the corner of the house. Meg did not stop scrubbing until her knuckles were raw. She did not look up, but she felt the heavy weight of a gaze from an upper window. Not the housekeeper this time, a different presence, colder, heavier, the Duke. He had been watching. Philip stood back from the library window, hands clasped behind his back. He had seen the entire exchange, the dog's quiet approach, the girl's bowed head, and the animal's final dejected retreat. He had heard her whisper, though not the words themselves, and watched her refuse the dog. It was unexpected. For months, Cinder had been like a ghost, a vessel of misery. He tolerated the groom who fed him, but offered no affection. He ignored Philip completely, as if in judgment. The dog had loved Edward with a fierce, singular devotion, and now that Edward was gone, Cinder seemed to be fading too. He was a constant worry, another weight on Philip's already burdened shoulders. Then weeks ago the whispers had started among the staff. The dog was following one of the new maids, a quiet, plain little thing. He had dismissed it as nonsense, the kind of gothic fantasy servants invent to pass the tedious hours. But then he saw it for himself, the giant beast, lying peacefully at the girl's feet in the long gallery. He felt a flicker of something then, not anger, but a sharp, probing curiosity. The dog had never been gentle with anyone but Edward. With strangers he was aloof, intimidating even. Yet with this girl, this Meg, he was docile, submissive. His housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, had been incensed. She saw it as a breakdown of order, an unseemly familiarity. A woman of rigid principles, Mrs. Finch had run Raventon for his father for 20 years, and now for him. Her efficiency was legendary. Her loyalty unquestionable. Philip trusted her judgment in all household matters. When she suggested the formal notice, he had agreed without much thought. It was a problem, and Mrs. Finch was proposing a solution. It seemed simple enough. But watching the scene on the steps, it no longer felt simple. The girl had not encouraged the dog. She had actively sent him away. There was no slyness in her posture, no bid for attention. There was only a small, determined figure, doing her work, obeying a rule that was manifestly aimed at her, and the dog's reaction, that great mournful sigh. Philip felt an answering pang in his own chest, a familiar ache. He knew that brand of sorrow. He turned from the window and walked over to his desk, a vast expanse of mahogany, covered in ledgers and maps of the estate. Work. Work was the only antidote. Rents to be collected, tenants to be placated, a coal seam to be surveyed. He was the Duke. He had duties. He had no time for the strange connection between a housemaid and his dead brother's dog. He sat down, picked up his pen, and stared at the page. But the numbers blurred. Why had she refused him? It was not out of fear. He had seen her with the dog before. She was not afraid of him. She had done it out of obedience, a simple, straightforward act. It was this that struck him as so unusual. In his experience, people were rarely simple or straightforward. They were driven by a complex machinery of self-interest. A housemaid who had captured the attention of the tragic talked-about Wolfhound might see it as an opportunity, a way to distinguish herself, perhaps even to curry favor with the master of the house. This girl had not. She had chosen invisibility, obeying a harsh rule, even when it cost her a moment of kindness. He did not look guilty, that was what she noticed most sharply. Then, a memory surfaced. Edward, laughing, wrestling with Cinder, as a pup on this very library rug. "He is a fine judge of character, you know," Edward had said, ruffling the dog's fur. "He hates fools and flatterers and only likes honest souls." Philip pushed the thought away. It was sentimental nonsense. It was a dog, an animal. Its instincts were not evidence of anything. Still, he found himself looking around the library. It was his favorite room, a haven of silence and order. 2 stories high, walled with books from floor to ceiling. A gallery ran along the upper level. The room smelled of leather, old paper, and beeswax. The girl Meg was often in here dusting. He was usually so absorbed in his work he barely registered her presence, a flicker of gray in the corner of his eye, the soft whisk of a cloth. She was utterly silent, unobtrusive. He realized now he had come to find her quiet industry calming. He stood up and walked to the fireplace, resting his arm on the marble mantelpiece. Cinder often lay on the rug here when he was in the room. Now, the rug was empty. The whole room felt emptier, colder. A thought, unwelcome and persistent, lodged in his mind. Mrs. Finch had described the girl as meddling and sly. He had accepted the description then. Now, he questioned it. What he had witnessed on the steps was not slyness. It was dignity, a quiet dignity that had chosen to obey even at the cost of turning away a grieving animal. He returned to his desk, the ledgers forgotten. He was the Duke of Whitchurch, the master of Raventarn. It was his duty to ensure his household was run with fairness and justice. And for the first time, he felt a sliver of doubt about the justice of Mrs. Finch's new rule. The days that followed were harder for Margaret. The invisible shield that Cinder's presence had provided was gone. Now she was just another maid, and one who had been singled out for censure. The other servants, taking their cue from Mrs. Finch, either ignored her or spoke with cool disdain. Her tasks became more arduous. She was sent to scrub floors in the coldest corridors, polish brass in the unused north wing, and sort mildewed linens in the cellar. It was a campaign of isolation, designed to make her life so miserable she would leave of her own accord. Margaret understood the strategy perfectly. She endured it with the same outward calm she did everything else. She ate her meals alone, her gaze fixed on her plate. She performed her duties without complaint. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears were exactly what people like Mrs. Finch wanted. But the work kept her from her true purpose. The library. Her evenings were now filled with mending tasks, assigned by the housekeeper, keeping her in the servants' hall until she was too exhausted to think of clandestine searches. She felt time slipping away. What if the Duke decided to clear out his father's old papers? What if Mrs. Finch, suspecting something, removed the very documents Margaret was looking for? She saw Cinder, only from a distance now. A gray shape moving through the dusk-shrouded gardens, or the glimpse of a tail disappearing down a corridor. He no longer approached her. He seemed to understand the new order of things. Each time she saw him, the ache in her chest sharpened. They were two lonely creatures in a house full of secrets, forbidden from offering each other the smallest comfort. One evening, nearly a fortnight after the notice was posted, she was tasked with taking a tea tray to the Dowager Duchess. The Duke's mother, Lady Mariella, had arrived for one of her infrequent visits from the dower house. She was a formidable old woman with eyes as sharp and intelligent as her son's, but hers held a warmth his lacked. Margaret entered the small, elegant drawing-room to find Lady Mariella seated by the fire, a book in her lap. The Duke stood by the window, staring out into the deepening twilight. The room was tense with a silence that was more than just quiet. Margaret curtsied, her eyes downcast, and set the tray on a low table. "Thank you," the Dowager said, her voice clear and unexpectedly kind, asking her name. "Meg, Your Grace." "Meg," Lady Mariella repeated, tasting the name, observing she was new there. Margaret explained she had been at Raventarn for 3 months, Your Grace. "And you are the one the dog has taken a fancy to." Margaret's breath caught. She could feel the Duke's attention shift from the window to her, his gaze a palpable weight on the back of her neck. "The dog keeps to himself now, Your Grace," she said carefully. "Yes, because of Philip's foolish rule," the Dowager said, her sharp gaze moving to her son. "I saw the notice. Finch's handiwork, I assume." "The woman has the subtlety of a blacksmith." The Duke turned fully from the window, his face a mask of cold composure. "Mrs. Finch manages the household," he said, explaining he does not interfere in her methods. "You should, when her methods are cruel," his mother retorted. She looked back at Margaret. "The animal is grieving, child, as is my son, though he would rather die than admit it. Cinder saw something in you, a gentleness, perhaps, and you were forced to rebuff him." "Is that not so?" Margaret did not know how to answer. A direct contradiction of the Duke was unthinkable, but to agree, felt like a betrayal of her own quiet integrity. She chose her words with immense care, saying she only follows the rules of the house, Your Grace. The Dowager Duchess smiled, with a small knowing expression. A very diplomatic answer, she murmured. You may go, Meg. Margaret curtsied again and backed out, closing the door softly behind her. She did not run, but walked at her usual measured pace down the corridor, her heart hammering against her ribs. Inside the drawing room, Philip faced his mother, saying she should not have involved her because she is a servant. She is a human being, Mariella said tartly, and one who has shown more sense and compassion than anyone else in this house. Did you see her face? The care she takes not to give offense. That is not the face of a sly, meddling girl. Philip, that is the face of someone with character. You know nothing about her, he countered. I know what the dog knows, his mother said, her voice softening. Edward always said Cinder was a fine judge of character. Perhaps we should listen to him. Instead of posting rules to keep them apart, you should ask why he seeks her out. She lifted her teacup. Grief needs an outlet, Philip, for beasts and for men. You have locked yourself away in this library, and you have ordered that poor creature to be sealed in his own sorrow. Look what it has done to you both. You are becoming as much of a ghost as he is. Philip had no answer. Her words struck too close to a truth he did not want to examine. He had only managed his pain through denial and relentless, exhausting work. He had mistaken this avoidance for strength. But remembering the quiet maid and hearing his mother's sharp words, he felt the first crack in his armor. Later that night, unable to focus on his ledger, he left the library to wander the silent hallways. He found himself on the upper floor near the wing where the female servants slept. He had no idea what drew him there. Standing in the shadows, he listened to the heavy silence of the sleeping house. Then a door at the far end of the hall creaked open. A sliver of candlelight cut through the dark. It was Meg. Fully dressed, a dark shawl wrapped around her shoulders, she held a single candle that cast a pale, watchful glow over her face. She peered down the long corridor, checking both ways. Moving as silently as a moth, she slipped away. She did not head for the grand staircase, but turned toward the narrow spiral stairs leading down to the servant quarters and the rear of the estate. Where was she going? The dark doubts planted by Mrs. Finch flared in his mind. A secret rendezvous. A theft. His impulse was to confront her immediately, but he stopped. His mother's warning echoed in his mind. That was not the face of a deceitful girl. He decided to follow her. Keeping to the darkness, his soft leather slippers made no sound on the floor. He trailed her at a distance, tracking the tiny flame of her candle as it sank into the dark depths of the mansion. Before we continue, a quick reminder. If you enjoy these stories, please subscribe to the channel. Margaret was heading for the library. It was a massive risk, but the Dowager's words had given her courage. Time was running out. She had to act now. She knew the Duke worked late, but he also took long midnight walks across the grounds. She was betting everything on his absence. Reaching the ground floor, she slipped through the black service halls, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. The manor was different in the dark. It was like a sleeping giant keeping its secrets well hidden. She pushed open the heavy door, separating the servants' quarters from the family rooms. The great hall was an empty cavern. High windows let in the pale moonlight, casting cold, ghostly shapes across the stone floor. The library was unlocked. Stepping inside, she shut the door without a sound, pausing to let her eyes adjust. The room carried his scent, leather ink and the crisp smell of the autumn air outside. Fading embers in the fireplace cast a weak crimson light, and her candle was a small speck of warmth in the immense dark. She knew exactly where to go. Her father had described this room to her when she was a child. The heart of the house, he had called it. He spoke of a collection of classical philosophy curated by the Duke's grandfather, who was a scholar himself. The books were kept up on the balcony gallery. She slipped behind a curtained alcove, found the narrow iron staircase, and began to climb. The steps felt freezing beneath her thin shoes. Up on the walkway, the shelves stretched high into the gloom. She raised her candle to read the faded gold lettering on the leather spines. Plato, Aristotle, and Marcus Aurelius. This was the place. An old family friend had suggested her father might have used a favorite trick, hiding papers inside a hollowed-out book or behind a loose panel on the shelf. Checking would only take a few minutes, but those were minutes she could not afford to lose. With shaking hands, she began tracing the shelves, her fingertips sliding over the spines, gently testing each volume. Was one lighter than the rest? Was there a hidden space behind them? The candle flame flickered, throwing distorted shadows against the walls. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked below. Margaret froze, her blood turning to ice. She pressed her back hard against the shelves, pinching the candle wick with her bare fingers, plunging the room into pitch blackness. She held her breath, listening intently. Nothing. Was it just her mind? Then a soft scrape, a log settling in the fireplace. Someone was down there. It had to be the Duke. He had not gone outside after all. He had been sitting in the dark the entire time, and her desperate gamble had completely failed. She was cornered. If he found her, it meant immediate dismissal, disgrace, and ruin. He could easily hand her over to the authorities, accusing her of trespassing and theft. She shrank back into the deep shadows, wishing she could melt into the library walls. Below, Philip sat quietly in his high-back chair, cloaked by the dark fireplace. He had returned to the room just moments before she arrived, cut short by his own restless thoughts. He was about to strike a match to light his lamp when he heard the heavy door click open. He stayed perfectly still, his curiosity eclipsing his irritation. He watched her glide across the room like a ghost and climb the spiral stairs. He knew exactly where she was going, the classical philosophy section. It was a bizarre target for a thief who would normally search his desk or the silver chest. Now, she was trapped up there, shivering in the dark, believing she was entirely alone. He did not stir. He remained silent. Part of him, the hunter who ruled this estate, wanted to confront her, trap her, and demand answers. But a different, quieter voice urged him to wait and watch. Why would a simple housemaid sneak into his private library at midnight, specifically searching for dusty volumes of ancient Greek thought? He sat in the dark like a stone monument, waiting for her next move. High on the balcony, Margaret's sheer terror began to cool into a sharp, desperate clarity. Staying here until morning was impossible. Eventually, he would light a lamp and discover her. Her only hope was to slip back down and reach the door while the room remained dark. But the stairs were on the far end of the walkway. She had to walk across the open gallery to reach them. Slowly, painfully, she took her first step. She dragged her feet along the wood, terrified to make a sound. One hand brushed the bookshelves, her palm sliding over the cold leather bindings. The scent of ancient paper reminded her of her father and of the comfortable life that had been stolen away. Being so close to her goal, yet completely powerless, was an actual physical ache. Reaching the top of the stairs, she could see the faint outline of the exit door, a gray shape in the shadows. She had to go down. As she took her first step, the old iron staircase groaned loudly in the dead silence. Below, Philip's head snapped up. There was no mistaking that sound. He rose quietly from his chair, moving with absolute stealth across the carpet, his eyes locked on the bottom of the stairs. Margaret felt her heart leap into her throat. It was over. He knew. Abandoning all attempts at stealth, she rushed down the remaining steps. She dashed toward the exit, her fingers brushing the cold brass handle, when a voice sliced through the dark, freezing her in place. "Stop!" It was not a shout, but a quiet, commanding tone that carried the heavy weight of a man accustomed to instant obedience. Margaret froze her back to him. She shut her eyes tight. This was the end. She heard him cross the floor without striking a match. He came to a halt just behind her, his close presence radiating heat and authority. "Turn around!" He ordered, his quiet voice laced with a dangerous edge. Slowly, she forced her body to cooperate. She turned to face him, keeping her eyes cast down and her hands tightly clasped. In the dark, she could only see his towering silhouette, outlined by the dying embers. He demanded to know what she was doing in his library. She remained silent. Truth was impossible, and a lie would be useless. He asked if she was looking for something to steal. "No, Your Grace," she whispered, surprised by her own steady tone. Then, what, he asked? Was it a midnight walk or a sudden passion for literature? His voice was dripping with cold sarcasm. Still, she said nothing. She had failed completely. Mrs. Finch would win, she would be cast out, and her father's memory would remain buried here forever. Despair nearly made her knees buckle, but right behind the fear came a sudden spark of defiance. She had stayed quiet for too long and endured too much pain. If this was indeed the end, she would not go down cowering. Raising her chin, she met his hidden gaze in the dark. "I was looking for a book." She said, her voice steady and clear. His quiet reaction was worse than the interrogation. He stepped closer, repeating her words, "A book at 2 in the morning." Which book? She had to tell him something. A title. Something plausible. Her mind raced, desperate to recall the spines she had just glimpsed. "The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius," she said. It was simply the first name that came to mind. She waited for his mockery, for instant disbelief. Instead, absolute silence. When he finally spoke, his sarcasm had vanished, replaced by a genuine freezing curiosity. Why that book? Because she started the truth, or at least a fragment of it slipping out. Because it is about enduring what you cannot change, about keeping your integrity when the world is unjust. The silence dragged on. 1 second, 2, 10. She could hear the mantel clock ticking, the soft whisper of the dying embers. He brushed past her, his sleeve catching her arm, as he moved toward the table. A match struck. An oil lamp flared, flooding the library with warm amber light. Margaret blinked against the sudden glow. He stood there, studying her. In the lamplight, his features seemed stark, all sharp angles and dark shadows. His golden brown eyes were narrowed, his face completely unreadable. There was no anger in his gaze. Instead, he stared as if seeing her for the very first time. "You read Latin?" he asked. His voice was soft, almost conversational. Her fragile world tilted. This was not the hostile interrogation she had expected. "And Greek," she whispered. He nodded slowly, as if she had just confirmed a suspicion he already harbored. His gaze dropped to her hands clasped tightly in front of her. They were a maid's hands, raw and chapped from strong lye soap and icy well water. Yet they were slender, elegant. Scholar's hands, his mother used to say. "Who are you?" he asked. He did not address her as a servant, but as an equal. The absolute truth burned on her tongue. "My name is Margaret Whitley." But 2 years of bitter hardship and daily humiliation held her back. His power over her life was absolute, a single word enough to destroy her. "I am only a housemaid, Your Grace," she murmured, lowering her eyes to the floorboards. He studied her in silence. "Mrs. Finch will call you a thief and demand I dismiss you. What do you expect me to do?" "I expect you to do what you believe is just, Your Grace," she replied softly. His mouth tightened. It was the perfect counter. It was polite, yet it pushed the weight of judgment entirely onto his shoulders. A quiet challenge to be the honorable man he claimed to be. He stepped to the bookshelf and pulled down a volume. Not Marcus Aurelius, but a thin book of poetry. He flipped it open and held it out. "Read," he commanded. She took the volume, her fingers shaking. The Greek text swam before her eyes. She inhaled slowly, steadied herself, and began. Her voice faltered at first, but grew steady as she fell into the cadence of the language. The beautiful ancient words echoed in the quiet room. She finished the entire page and looked up. He was staring at her with reluctant, dawning astonishment. He had expected her to stumble, to expose herself as a fraud. Instead, he faced pure academic fluency, a flawless accent, and a deep, clear understanding of the verses. He took the book back, his fingers brushing hers in a brief electric shock of contact. "Go back to your room," he commanded, his voice strained. "Speak of this to no one. I will handle Mrs. Finch. He turned his back, a silent dismissal. Margaret curtsied, her head spinning as she fled the room. Her heart hammered wildly, not with terror but with a sudden, dangerous hope. She was still employed. More than that, she had been truly seen. For the first time in 2 years, someone had looked past her uniform and recognized the woman beneath. And that she knew was a far deeper peril than any she had faced before. Philip did not sleep. Long after Margaret left him, he stood motionless in the library holding the poetry book. The quiet of the room had changed. It was no longer empty. It echoed with the ghost of her voice and the weight of a shocking revelation. A simple maid who read classical Greek with the rough hands of a laborer and the keen intellect of a scholar. A thief who broke into his house not for silver but for Stoic philosophy. It was a bizarre puzzle his neat, logical mind could not unravel. In his mind he saw her face in the lamplight again. She was pale and terrified, yet possessed a fierce dignity. I expect you to do what you think is just. No tears, no begging, just a challenge. He thought of Cinder, his massive, grieving hound, who ignored everyone else, but trailed this girl like a shadow. He is a fine judge of character, Edward had once remarked. Philip had ignored the comment then. Now he was not so sure. His dog had seen what he had missed, recognizing an inner worth that had nothing to do with her low station. And then there was Mrs. Finch. He had to handle the housekeeper. His immediate urge was to shield the girl, to forbid Mrs. Finch from firing her. But that would only fuel the woman's malice and suspicion. It would make Margaret's daily life in the servants' hall an absolute nightmare. He needed solid facts. Walking over to his heavy desk, he bypassed the estate ledgers and drew a fresh sheet of parchment toward him. He began writing a letter to an old contact in London, a man who owed him a major favor and possessed a rare, quiet talent for uncovering secrets. He detailed everything he had observed, her approximate age, her striking appearance, and the false name she went by, Meg. He noted her remarkable fluency in classical languages, asking his contact to search for any trace of a lady matching that profile, perhaps a gentlewoman fallen on hard times. He sealed the missive and placed it ready for the morning post. Only then did he let himself contemplate the terrifying implications. If she was indeed a high-born lady, forced into servitude by tragedy, her presence indicted his entire world. A rigid society built on status where such horrors were never supposed to occur. Through his own ignorance, he had been complicit in her shame. A novel emotion stirred beneath his heavy grief and duty, a sharp, fierce urge to protect her. He had promised to handle Mrs. Finch, and he meant to keep his word. But he would do it his way. The next morning, the housekeeper requested an audience. Philip received her in the library where the midnight drama had unfolded. Mrs. Finch entered stiff and radiating grim satisfaction. "Your Grace," she began without preamble, "I must report a severe breach. The maid Meg was caught attempting to rob the house last night." Philip remained behind his desk, fingers steeped, offering no seat. Indeed, he murmured coolly, "Caught by whom?" "By myself, Your Grace. I have watched her closely for weeks. Her behavior is highly irregular. I saw her slip away after midnight and followed her. She broke into this library." Philip narrowed his eyes. A lie. A clumsy, outright lie. He had been the one in this room. He had followed Margaret while Mrs. Finch slept. "You followed her yourself?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. "Yes, Your Grace. I caught her in the act." She spoke with total confidence. "And what was she stealing? I had no time to check. She fled when confronted. But her guilt is clear. She is a thief, and for the safety of this house, she must be dismissed, perhaps even handed to the law." Philip let a heavy silence fill the room. He looked at this woman who had managed his household for 20 years. He had always believed she was its moral bedrock, loyal, efficient, utterly honest. But now, looking through a different lens, he saw another side of her. He saw a petty tyrant. A woman so obsessed with protecting her tiny kingdom that she would lie straight to his face to destroy a perceived rival. "Your dedication to security is admirable, Mrs. Finch," he said slowly. But this time you are mistaken, the housekeeper gasped, her mouth dropping open. Your Grace, I was in the library last night. Philip continued, his voice dropping to an icy calm. I was here all night. The girl Meg did not break in. I was working late and summoned her myself. Mrs. Finch stared, her calm facade crumbling. Disbelief and confusion warred on her face. You summoned her. A housemaid. To the library after midnight. Yes, I did. I needed a text from the upper gallery, and did not care to climb the stairs. He lied, the falsehood sliding out effortlessly. He was beating her at her own game. She fetched the volume and returned to her quarters. There was no theft, no misconduct, only a servant obeying her master. The color drained from Mrs. Finch's face as the truth of the situation hit her. She was not believed. Her authority was publicly, utterly crushed. She was losing, but her presence. Your Grace. It was at my request, Philip cut in, his voice like flint. Is that clear? Yes, Your Grace, she whispered, her eyes falling to the floor. Then the matter is settled. The girl stays. She will face no dismissal and no punishment. She is to continue her duties. And you, Mrs. Finch, will leave her alone. My orders stand for both of you. He paused, letting the silence weigh upon her. You may go. For a second she stiffened as if to protest, but the Duke's cold, unyielding face told her it was hopeless. She had risked too much and lost. With a stiff, awkward curtsy, she retreated, her humiliation hanging heavy in the air. Philip watched her leave. There was no triumph in this victory, only a cold, bitter disappointment. He had trusted her, he had relied on her, yet she had lied, driven by nothing but malice, toward a quiet, lonely girl. His mother was right. He had been blind. He knew his actions would bring consequences. This house was a fragile web of gossip and strict hierarchy. By lunchtime, the story would flood the servants' hall. The Duke himself had stepped in to protect a common maid from the housekeeper's anger. It would isolate Margaret even more, making her a target of deep jealousy and suspicion. He had saved her from being cast out only to push her into a different kind of fire. He walked over to the window, looking down at the front steps. That was where he had watched her turn the dog away. Now, a strange, intense urge pulled at him, a need to find her, to make sure she was safe, to talk to her. But what could he possibly say? He dared not share his suspicions. Not yet. He could never treat her as an equal without shattering her fragile peace. He was bound by the same rigid class lines that imprisoned her. For now, he could only watch from afar and wait for the post from London. The change in the house was sudden and sharp. Margaret felt the tension the second she stepped into the kitchens that morning. The morning chatter died instantly. Servants stopped and stared. Low whispers trailed her as she gathered her mops and buckets. She was no longer just Meg, the quiet housemaid. She had become a mystery, a subject of curiosity, specifically the Duke's curiosity. Mrs. Finch ignored her completely, passing orders through a junior housekeeper with a face carved from pure ice. The brutal, punishing chores stopped. Instead, Margaret found herself on the normal schedule, mostly working upstairs in the family wing. It was a small but heavy shift. She was being kept close. Was this the Duke's command or the housekeeper's way of watching her every move? She could not tell. She kept her head down, her face a mask, but her mind was spinning. The Duke had saved her. He had even lied for her. Why? What did he know? She could not shake the memory of his eyes in the library or his soft, haunting question, "Who are you?" He had built a shield around her, a fragile, temporary safety. Yet it was a gilded cage. Exposed and isolated, she could no longer slip away to search the house. Mrs. Finch and the servants watched her every move. Her only comfort was Cinder. The morning after her clash with the Duke, the notice on the green board had disappeared. Nobody mentioned it. It had just vanished. That afternoon, while she aired out the linens, a massive gray head nudged the door open. Cinder trotted in and lay at her feet, breathing a heavy sigh. Margaret stopped, looking down, her heart swelled with a raw, aching gratitude. She knelt on the floor, reaching out for the very first time, her fingers buried deep into the thick fur of his neck. He leaned in, his eyes slowly closing. "You knew, didn't you?" she whispered to him. "You knew I wasn't what I seemed." The dog just let out a low, peaceful rumble. From then on, he stayed by her side. It was a comfort, but it was also a warning. In the quiet politics of the house, the dog's loyalty mirrored the Duke's. Seeing the animal at her heels, the servants understood she was for now completely untouchable. The Duke himself stayed in the shadows. He and Margaret never spoke of that night again. When they crossed paths in the hallways, he only offered a sharp nod, keeping his expression perfectly blank. Yet his gaze always lingered on her, a heartbeat too long. And occasionally, while she dusted the library and he worked at his desk, she would catch him staring. An unspoken question hung in his golden brown eyes. These quiet, tense moments became the rhythm of their days. It was a secret conversation flowing beneath the rigid roles they had to play. He saw her, and she knew it. One afternoon, the Dowager Duchess summoned her once more. This time there was no excuse about needing tea. Lady Mariella sat in her drawing room, quietly clipping stems. Cinder was asleep on the rug. "Come in, child. Close the door," she said, not looking up. Margaret obeyed. "My son has taken an interest in you," the Dowager remarked, snipping a rose. "His Grace has been fair to me," Margaret said carefully. Lady Mariella looked up, her eyes razor-sharp. "Philip is many things. Dutiful, intelligent, far too serious. But he is not fair. He is just. There is a difference. Fairness is giving people what they deserve. Justice is giving them what they are owed, and he seems to think you are owed something." She paused, her stare piercing. "Is he right?" Margaret's throat tightened. This was the most dangerous question she had faced yet. The Dowager was not her son. Her instincts as a woman were much sharper. "I am a housemaid. Your Grace and I am only owed my wages." The Dowager smiled softly. "You are a terrible liar, child. Your mouth speaks one truth, but your eyes tell another. You have the look of someone who has lost everything." She set down her shears. "I am not your enemy, Margaret. I know how Mrs. Finch watches you. I have known that woman for 20 years. She is a capable housekeeper, but fiercely possessive. She hates any challenge to her power, and you, for some reason, represent a massive threat to her." She walked over, taking Margaret's hand and turning it over to inspect the calloused palm. "These are not the hands of a common maid," she whispered softly. "No more than that plain gray dress is your true gown. Who is it you are protecting with this silence?" Tears stung Margaret's eyes. This was the first gentle kindness she had known in years, and it was far harder to fight than any cruelty. "I cannot say," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Very well," the Dowager replied, letting go of her hand. "But remember, when you are ready to talk, some in this house will listen." She pointed to the sleeping dog. "He is one. I am another. And I believe my son is the third." The letter from London arrived 1 week later. Philip carried it to the library, his hands trembling as he broke the wax seal. He read the pages once quickly, then again slowly. The investigator had been relentless. He found no record of any Meg, but after widening his search he uncovered the story of Miss Margaret Whitley, daughter of the late respected scholar Alistair Whitley. A well-born, educated woman fluent in classics, left entirely penniless after her father died 2 years ago. There was a contested will and a greedy relative named Finch. The lawyer who ran the case was later disbarred for malpractice. After that, Miss Whitley had simply vanished into thin air. At the bottom of the page was her physical description. Slender dark hair, gray-green eyes, dignified, quiet, and highly intelligent. Philip dropped the paper onto his desk. Whitley. Every piece fell into place. The brilliance, the cruelty, and the name Finch. Mrs. Finch was the sister of the thief who had stolen everything from her. It was far worse than he ever imagined. She had walked straight into the lion's den, into her enemy's household, bowing to the very woman whose family had destroyed her. The absolute desperate bravery of it left him speechless. He looked around the room. This library was not just a sanctuary for him, it was her target. She believed her proof was hidden here. She had risked her entire life to cross this threshold. A dark, frozen anger, heavier than anything he had ever known, took hold of his chest. Rage for her at the raw injustice and at his own profound blindness. He was the master of this house, yet under his roof a gentlewoman had been forced to scrub floors and endure the malice of those who built their wealth on her ruin. His mother's words echoed in his mind. Justice is giving people what they are owed. He knew what he had to do. Standing up, he began to search. He looked not for a single book, but for the section that would have drawn a true scholar like Alistair Whitley. He started where she had near the philosophy volumes. He pulled down books, ran his hands along the woodwork, and tapped the panels. He worked with silent, grim intensity. Hours bled away. The light outside faded. Finally, up on the high gallery close to where she had stood that night, he found it. A piece of the solid shelving was actually a disguised door concealing a hidden cabinet. It was locked, and he had no key. He hurried downstairs, grabbed a heavy iron poker from the hearth, and returned. With one sharp, violent blow, he smashed the lock. The door swung open. Inside, resting under a thick layer of dust, lay a small leather case and a heavy bound book. He brought the items down to his desk and opened the portfolio first. Inside was a bundle of letters written in a neat, scholarly hand, all signed by Alistair Whitley. Below those papers lay a deed of title for a property in Devon called Rosewood Cottage, naming his beloved daughter, Margaret Helen Whitley, as the sole beneficiary. Finally, he opened the book. It was a rare first edition of Homer, and tucked inside the cover was a second letter. This letter was from Whitley to Philip's late father, the Duke. "My Lord Duke," it began, "I fear my health is failing. I have enclosed the deed and private papers for safekeeping, as I no longer trust my wife's relatives, especially her cousin Mr. Finch. Should anything happen to me, I beg you to ensure this portfolio reaches my daughter Margaret. She is all I have left. The book is a token of my deep gratitude for your friendship." Everything lay before him, the proof, the motive, the betrayal. His father had been trusted with her future, but upon his death that promise was broken. The documents had been forgotten, concealed behind a hidden panel. He sat at his desk as darkness fell, staring at the scattered papers, feeling the immense weight of his family's failure and his own. Simply handing over the papers would not do. That would feel like charity, and it would never restore what she had lost. Her name, her standing, her dignity. Those had to be reclaimed, not gifted, and it had to happen right in front of the person who had stolen them. He reached out and rang the bell for a footman. "Find Mrs. Finch," he said, his voice quiet and firm, "and then fetch the maid Meg. Bring them both to me here." The summons felt like a dark warning. When the footman located Margaret, his face was pale. "The Duke requires you in the library," he said, "and Mrs. Finch as well." The walk to the library felt endless. Cinder, sensing her distress, padded quietly at her side. The massive dog was a warm, comforting presence in the quiet hall. Mrs. Finch was already waiting by the Duke's desk, her expression stiff, though a hint of victory gleamed in her eyes. She believed this was the end, the moment Margaret would be exposed and banished. But then Margaret noticed the documents on the desk, the leather portfolio, and the familiar heavy binding of her father's Homer. Her breath caught. The Duke stood up when she entered, ignoring Mrs. Finch entirely. His gaze was fixed on Margaret, filled with an expression she had never seen in him before, a deep, heavy remorse. "Come here," he said gently. She walked forward until she stood right beside the housekeeper, with Cinder taking up his post at her heels. A low growl rumbled in the dog's chest as he stared at Mrs. Finch. The Duke looked at the housekeeper, his face hardening like stone. "Mrs. Finch, you told me you caught this girl stealing in this room. You lied." The housekeeper opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She was not stealing. The Duke continued, his voice cold and sharp. She was searching for what was stolen from her. Searching for what your brother took her home, her fortune, her very name. He picked up the deed from his desk, but instead of handing it to Margaret, he held it up for the housekeeper to see. "Do you recognize the name Alistair Wheatley?" he asked. Every trace of color drained from Mrs. Finch's face as she stared at the papers. Her composure shattered like glass. He was a scholar. The Duke said, his voice relentless. "A friend of my father. He had a daughter, a girl who was cheated of her inheritance by your brother and cast out with nothing." He let the silence hang in the air, heavy and damning. Then he turned his gaze directly to Margaret, speaking to her in front of another. He spoke her real name. "Is that not so, Miss Wheatley?" he asked. Hearing those words in this room felt like a key turning in a lock deep inside her soul. Miss Wheatley. She was no longer Meg the maid. She was herself again. Tears she had held back for 2 years finally spilled down her cheeks, and she could only nod in silence. Mrs. Finch made a small choked sound. It was over her lies, her petty cruelties, and her brother's grand theft, all laid bare under the lamp. I didn't know," she stammered in a pathetic whisper. "My brother said the girl was no good, that her father had debts. He lied," Philip said, his voice flat and empty of pity. "And you chose to believe him, punishing a young woman in your care. You did it because you feared she threatened your position. You saw her dignity and mistook it for arrogance. You saw her grief and called it insolence." He looked from the cowering housekeeper to the weeping young woman. His expression softened as his gaze rested on Margaret. "This house has failed you, Miss Wheatley," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "My father failed you, and I have failed you. That is a debt that can never be fully repaid." He pointed to the documents on his desk. "These are yours, they always were." Mrs. Finch finally broke, letting out a dry, racking sob. It was not remorse, but defeat, the sound of a woman who built her life on control, only to see it turn to dust. "What will you do with me?" she whispered, staring at the floor. Philip stared at her in silence. Cast her out as she had tried to do to Margaret would be easy, but he looked at Margaret's tear-streaked face and saw only relief, not triumph. He recognized the quiet dignity that had captivated him from the start. Vengeance was not what she wanted, nor was it justice. "You will pack your things," he said, his voice heavy with weariness. "A carriage will take you to the dower house, and my mother will place you on a remote estate. You will have a cottage and a small pension to live out your days in obscurity. It is far more than you deserve, and far more mercy than you showed to Miss Wheatley." He did not need to say another word. He had stripped away her power, her position, and her pride. He left her with nothing but her life a ruin as complete as the one she had tried to inflict on Margaret. The footman was summoned, and the broken housekeeper was led away. The Duke and Margaret were left alone in the library with the sleeping dog and the silent truth between them. "Thank you," she whispered, wiping her tears. "It is I who should thank you," he replied. He stepped around the desk and stood before her. "You came into this cold house of grief and reminded me what integrity looks like," he said. "You did not complain or despair, you endured, and you taught me to see again." He reached out not to touch her, but to gently push the leather portfolio across the desk toward her. "This is the proof of who you are, but you never needed it," he said. "You were always Margaret Wheatley, and I was simply too blind to see." He wanted to say more, to tell her that the thought of her leaving Raventhorn was unbearable, and to ask her to stay, not as a maid or a guest, but as something more. But the words would not come. The social divide between their stations was still a terrifying chasm. So he said the only thing he could, the only thing that truly mattered: "Welcome home, Miss Wheatley." 6 months later, summer had come to Raventhorn. The bleak gray countryside had been transformed into a vibrant expanse of greens and golds. Sunlight streamed through the tall library windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. But it was a happy dust now born of life and restoration. Margaret stood on a rolling ladder, carefully placing a book onto a newly polished shelf. She no longer wore the maid's drab gray, but a simple gown of pale green muslin that brought out the color of her eyes. Her hair was no longer hidden under a cap, but coiled neatly at the nape of her neck. She was not the mistress of Raventhorn, not yet. She was something quieter, and perhaps more important. She was its curator. After that fateful night in the library, she had not left. The Duke had made her an offer. Her Devon property was recovered, and his solicitors were pursuing the funds from her father's stolen books. She was a woman of independent means again, yet he asked her to stay. "My father left this library in absolute chaos," he had said, his formal tone shielding the deep emotion in his eyes. "My own interests are in agriculture," he had explained, "so it needs a scholar's hand, your father's or his daughter's. Would you consider taking on the project as a salaried curator? There is a suite of rooms in the East Wing where you would be your own mistress." It was an ideal solution, giving her a purpose, a place, and most of all, time. Time to navigate the fragile, unspoken connection growing between them. She had accepted. Her days were now spent in the room she once feared, surrounded by the books she loved. She was bringing her father's work and the collection of the Duke's grandfather back to life. Under her gentle care, the library was no longer a tomb of grief. It was becoming the heart of the home once more. The door opened and Philip entered. He had changed too, the rigid black coats replaced by relaxed country clothes. The lines of grief around his eyes had softened, and he even smiled now and then. "The new shelving has arrived from the village," he said. "I saw it," she replied, smiling down from the ladder. "Thomas the carpenter did a wonderful job." Philip observed that the man worked well under her direction, as did the entire staff. He added that she commanded far more loyalty than Mrs. Finch ever had with all her rules. They rarely spoke of the former housekeeper now. The dowager had arranged her quiet banishment, allowing the house to heal under a new kinder woman, recommended by Margaret. He came to the foot of the ladder and looked up, asking if she would walk with him, as the light was perfect by the lake. "Of course," she replied. Descending the ladder, she accepted his hand. His touch was warm and firm. It was a small, simple gesture, yet it sent a tremor through her. Their relationship was built on these quiet moments, a shared look across a dinner table, a book left open for her to find, or a walk in the gardens. They left the house joined by Cinder, who rose from his favorite spot on the rug. The great hound was transformed, his coat glossy and his gait energetic as he trotted happily beside them, no longer a ghost but a guardian. They walked in comfortable silence toward the shimmering lake. Breaking the silence, Philip mentioned that the solicitors expected a final settlement from the Finch estate within the month, making her a wealthy woman. He had started using her given name, Margaret, in the quiet of the library, and it still felt as momentous as a formal declaration. Looking at the great house, the peaceful landscape, and him, she softly replied that she had all the wealth she needed. He stopped asking if she was truly happy there. "I have never been happier," she said, and it was the simple truth. She had her name, her father's legacy, and a home in the most unlikely place. Philip spoke in a low voice, his serious, tawny eyes fixed on her. He explained that he was a slow, methodical man who did not rush into things, whether in farming or other matters. But his patience had reached its limit. Taking both her hands in his, he confessed how accustomed he had become to her presence, her voice in the library and her shadow beside his. The thought of her absence was intolerable. Taking a breath, he asked her to stay, not as his curator, but as his wife, the Duchess of Whitchurch. Margaret's heart seemed to expand. This was the moment all their quiet conversations and shared glances had promised. She did not feign surprise or look away, but met his gaze with steady dignity. Addressing him by his name for the very first time, she softly admitted she had been waiting for him to ask. At her words, a slow smile spread across his face. His severe expression was replaced by a genuine, breathtaking warmth that transformed his features. He murmured that his reputation for being methodical was entirely undeserved, calling himself a fool for waiting so long. He did not kiss her then, as it was not his way. Instead, he held her hands with a deep, steadfast devotion, while Cinder, sensing the peaceful resolution, rested his great head against their joined hands, looking at the grieving Duke, who had finally learned to see, and the gentle dog who had known her all along. Margaret felt the silence of Raventorn, filled with a quiet, enduring love. Thank you for listening to this story to the very end. Please share in the comments which city you are watching from and what this story made you feel. Remember to subscribe so you never miss our upcoming stories.